Welcome to the Biblioteca Orientalis. Today, in the new home of the Biblioteca Jacobilli in Foligno, Italy, we start a new season of A Coffee With. Our first guest is Professor Robert Adam, architect, urban designer, author, and, if I may say, humanist. He is famous for championing classical architecture and traditional architecture. I just want to mention his latest book, Time for Architecture, on modernity, memory, and urban design. And the building that I appreciate very much, the Bodleian Art and Archaeology and Ancient World Library in Oxford. How did you decide to become a classicist architect?
Well, I became a classicist because quite early in my architectural training, I realized that what I was being trained to do, most people I knew who weren't architects really didn't like it. And this seemed to me strange, that I should be designing for people in general for something that people didn't like. And eventually, after some time in Rome, I realized that what I underlay most of what people liked had traditional content, and for a very good reason. And that underlying that, particularly in Western architecture, underlying those traditions was generally classicism. But in fact, I generally prefer to call myself a traditional architect, because all classical architecture is traditional, but not all traditional architecture is classical. The idea that somehow classicism just belongs to the past is rather curious, because 19th century classicism belonged to the 19th century, 18th century classicism belonged to the 18th century, early 20th century classicism belonged to the early 20th century, and late 20th, early 21st century classicism belongs to the late 20th and early 21st century. The fact that something has been used in the past doesn't mean that it shouldn't be used in the present, or that it only specifically belongs to the past. In fact, just about everything that we do has got some origin in the past. And why should this not be true with architecture?
How is it possible to do classical architecture in a globalized world?
Dealing with architecture in any kind of global sense means that there's two ways in which architecture is dealt with globally. One is you effectively the dominant cultural architecture is the one that is used. So that would apply very often in colonial architecture. So in India, Britain exported its architecture. The French exported their architecture. Sometimes they come up with hybrids, but let's make that a general principle. What's happening now is the North Atlantic countries, North Atlantic architecture, which is basically modernism, that's where it came from, is now being exported to other countries. So that's loosely what you would call homogenization. The feature of globalization now is that every city looks like a North American city. So that's happening anyway. Now, once you accept that classical architecture is traditional, and I prefer the word traditional to classical, then of course you're able to relate to local traditions. It's very interesting because in the past these traditions moved about. So for example, Mughal architecture in India has a very strong affinity with classical architecture. Chinese traditional architecture, not so much, although there are some affinities. The roof, for example, is absolutely critical in Chinese architecture in a way that it's not in European or North Atlantic architecture. In the Middle East, there's a very strong crossover with classicism. I mean, after all, it was as effectively the Middle East became a Muslim world, it did so by taking over a Byzantine world, which is effectively a classical world. So, although it has its own characteristics, there is a very strong cross-relationship. But in every case, there is something local and something traditional. And the point about traditions is that they are the things to which people relate. We all relate to our traditions. I mean, the way I'm speaking in English, that's a traditional, that's actually a British or an American tradition, and everyone relates to it. The clothes I'm wearing are again distinctive of where I come from, and so on and so on. So that's why I always prefer traditional to classical. But you can talk about a classical Egyptian building, or you can talk about a classical Chinese building, or you can talk about a classical Indian building. In doing so, it's a classique as a contrary to classical.
Can you tell me something more about the Doha papers?
So I was sent out to produce a paper on the development of Doha. One of the most interesting experiences I've had. I had very good interviews with government ministers, the director of the National Gallery. I got very good introductions. And I was able to go right back to the time when Doha was a very small emirate with really very little building indeed. And you could actually see what happened. In fact, what happened was again, all of these things are political and economic. They're never not political and economic. It was a British protectorate. This was a very clever colonial trick, a protectorate. It meant you protected the country from other foreign powers. In other words, you took over its foreign policy, which you let the country get on. When oil was discovered, and it was discovered before the Second World War, but was not really exploited until the 1950s, this country started to become very wealthy very quickly. I mean, extremely poor in the 1950s, and it then became extremely wealthy. So they had to develop very quickly. And so what they did was they brought in foreign expertise. And the initial expertise they brought in was British, and then it was American. So what you got was this gradual development well, not gradual, extremely rapid development. Very particularly interesting in this process. In the first instance, it had a very, very distinctively Western character. They built ring roads, they built a big pyramidal hotel, which was designed by an American architect, and so on and so on. But more recently, the Emir particularly has taken an interest in how do we actually produce something that's local. So the souk was restored, and it was restored in an interesting way. It was restored by an architect that he found. He came across who had designed a new house in a suburb that was of a traditional type. And so the souk it's kind of traditional and kind of not, in the sense that some of it's reproduction, some of it's not original. Then, of course, there's the issue of how you design much larger buildings, because there isn't really a tradition of large buildings. So there are two directions were taken in this. One was to employ people like Jean Nouvel, the big star architects, and to produce something that could be anywhere, frankly. And West Bay, frankly, could be anywhere. The other thing was to introduce Islamic features in what I would call a postmodern way, in a kind of cartoon manner. You just put a great big Islamic arch all over a tower, which is what they did. The other one is interesting, is what happened with the National Museum, is that they made it into a symbolic representation of something that was local. So it's supposed to look like a desert rose being a rock formation. Jean Nouvel will claim that he thought of this, but the director of a national museum will tell you he thought of it. So who thought of it, I don't know. Or then you get IMP's museum, which actually is interesting. It's a very, very successful modernist building because that sort of elemental geometry suits Islamic architecture very well. But that is a pair with another building, which was actually designed to promote Islam effectively. One promoted it with art, the other promoted it with culture, and it tends to rely more on Egyptian prototypes. So you have this very, very interesting, complex situation arising, where the response is either totally global, in other words, what I would call North Atlantic, or it's a kind of cartoon version, which is sort of what a lot of architects do. And they say, oh, well, they come up with a cartoon version of what Islamic means. It means kind of pointed arches, and they make it look like it's made out of paper or cardboard. Or you get hybrids, or you introduce something which comes from another Islamic country which has a tradition of larger buildings. I think there's a thing called the Barzan Tower, which actually expresses this all-in-one building, completely schizophrenic building, Egyptian on the bottom and glass tower on the top.
Talking about sustainability, is a traditional building sustainable by definition?
The issue of sustainability is very interesting. Because when people first became interested in it, everyone assumed it was a technical thing. And therefore, architects who were interested in technical things thought that they had the keys to the kingdom of heaven. They thought that actually this was theirs. What people began to realize, this really wasn't the case. That traditional buildings, of course, had their origins in a time when moving anything about was extremely labor intensive, extremely expensive. Oil is unbelievably efficient as an energy source. So you tended to build in local materials, and that's the way it worked, and you adapted whatever it was for local materials. But I have to say, it's probably fair to say that that doesn't really happen so much now, although it can do. What is completely insane, I mean, totally, utterly insane, is our glass-walled buildings. Because these are based on a sort of theoretical attitude to art, to glass rather, in the 1920s and 30s. And it's become a kind of standard. And it's just about the most unsustainable thing you can do. Now, it's pretty unsustainable in a moderate climate, like most of Europe, I mean, Northern Europe particularly. But it's completely mad in a hot country. I mean, it's completely and utterly mad. Now, interestingly, in Doha, they started taking interest in sustainable architecture, but they kept saying, well, we must keep using glass. Well, you think, no, I'm sorry, this is completely mad. You realize they're stuck on it as a kind of symbolic material. But what we actually undertook a piece of research with a leading environmental scientists, on a building which was a masonry solid, it was a dense construction with windows, and a glass wall building, two theoretical buildings. The glass wall building had triple glazing, argon-filled, solar-controlled glass on two sides. Traditional building had masonry walls, all had insulation behind them, double glazed windows, and the windows were holes in the wall. That building outperformed in every measure the building with glass walls, in every single measure, from offices, houses, everything. And that was in a moderate climate. Now, another interesting thing that happened in Doha was that they introduced a suburban housing type. This was actually British planners did this, suburban housing type. That sat in the middle of its plot or lot, as a contrary to the traditional courtyard type, most of which only now exist in the centre of Doha and are largely let out. The people have left them and moved to the suburbs. But the courtyard type is incredibly successful. But what happens with these isolated buildings is one side of the building is completely unusable because it's always hot all the time. The second thing is in the courtyard building, you had complete privacy. Privacy is very important, particularly family privacy, particularly privacy for women. So the courtyard house, that happened anyway. But what happens with these suburban houses is that they have to build high walls all the way around them, so they obtain the privacy. So you end up with a gap on the south side which you can't live in because it's too hot. So what had happened, of course, is the traditional architecture had evolved and suited the climate very, very well. And then you introduce another type which doesn't, and that's a microcosm of the problem of the glass wall tower block, which is another case of the same thing. It's not really much good anywhere, but it's really, really bad in a hot climate. So it's a complicated issue. The other thing is this is the thing that is largely forgotten in measures of sustainability. Sustainability is generally measured by, there's a metric for it. You have to have a metric. And you therefore you can demonstrate that this building is more sustainable because it lets in, it holds so much more heat, etc., etc. Traditional buildings, some measures have been done quite recently, is that actually they get better over time. There's something curious about this. Their stability in terms of heat, they're very stable. They will retain heat from the day and use it effectively at night and vice versa. The other thing, what we call the elephant in the room, the kind of issue, one of the real problems, which is forgotten in all this metric, is there's a statement made by the former president of the American Institute of Architects, which said the most sustainable building is the one that's already there. is that people forget that longevity is a very, very important issue for sustainability. If you don't have to build a building for 200 years, or 100 years, or even 80 years, and the amount of energy that is saved and locked up in that building is incredible. If you have to replace it every 20, 30, 40 years, you will never recover, or hardly ever will you recover, that the energy required simply to rebuild the building. And the thing about traditional buildings is they tend to be permanent. And permanence, or longevity, is an absolutely fundamental issue in sustainability. But because there is no universally accepted form of measurement for that, it never appears in the calculations. So people will say, the Americans would say, high LEED standard and so on. And actually you can say this about glass wall buildings, which is mad. Because the longevity of the building does not come into the calculation.
What does designing a traditional building mean to you?
I think when people talk about building traditionally, they make a fundamental error. The fundamental error is that you're producing a copy of an old building. There's a really fundamental issue here. Tradition is not history. History is something that's in the past and is fixed. What happened 100 years ago happened 100 years ago. Now you may be able to interpret it different ways, but it'll always be the same. What tradition is something that's happening now. It's happening all the time, and it's not static. It's something that's constantly moving. And not all traditions are good. I mean, slavery was a tradition. It's not good. Traditions aren't necessarily good. Also, they're not the same. But the thing about a tradition is it's the opposite from a revolution. A revolution, you actually change something radically and permanently. And tradition builds on experience, and it builds on experience. But you can carry on and develop it and change it. So, for example, in India, I'm building a building where it has a relationship between Mughal architecture, has a relationship between Mughal architecture and classical architecture, which exists in India. But I'm designing column capitals, which are unlike any column capitals anywhere. Well, a lot of people looking at them would say, well, that's familiar, but I know they're not. So you can keep developing tradition. That's the point about a tradition. It is something that's constantly moving. But a tradition is you could always understand where it came from. It's a narrative. It's like writing a book. Let's say you write a novel, and you have to write a new chapter. So you write a new chapter. Now, if you were to make any sense of the novel, the next chapter you write has to be clear that it comes from the narrative which was in the previous chapters. That doesn't mean the next chapter you write is the same as the previous chapters. It just means that there is a narrative from the beginning of the book, and it carries on. So all you're doing with tradition is you're writing the next chapter in the book. So of course that can always be original, because the next chapter can't be like the previous chapters, or it'll just be very boring.
How do you proceed when you design a building in a country that is not your own?
If I'm building in a country where I'm not that familiar with the traditions, the obvious thing, of course, is you read as much as you can and you look as much as you can. The one thing will never do, extremely difficult to do, is to understand the nuances of that tradition. So probably, I design work in India, and I have a lot of Indian friends, and I work very closely in India. India's peculiar because there's something about India that's built into the British way of life too. I mean, the connection is so strong but nonetheless, even then, I will work very closely with an Indian architect, someone with whom I'm sympathetic and sympathetic to me. Probably my best example is buildings I designed in Beirut, where I worked with a Lebanese architect, being a very good friend, called Fadl Al-Adaga. And he explained things to me that I probably would never have got from a book. He told me he could enter any village in the Lebanon and tell if it was a Christian or Muslim village immediately. Not by looking at a mosque or looking at a church. It was something he could tell that I would never understand. Not that I was doing that, but that was an idea. And he also explained to me the significance of the mandaloon, a very particular quasi-Venetian window type, which is not as unique, but it's very characteristic of Beirut. But it's not just a window, it's what the window, it was a window on the first floor, or the sort of European first floor, the American second floor, in which people sat and looked out on the street. Very specific in Beirut. Now, I could have easily just taken that window and stuck it on a building and said, that's very nice, I'm producing a sort of Beiruti building. But I wouldn't have been, because I wouldn't have understood its significance. So there's a lot of very subtle things. But there is the other issue. What you want to avoid is becoming what I call an aeroplane architect, where you look out the window of the aeroplane and say, hey guys, I think I know what this is. It's all pointed arches. And you kind of stick pointed arches on a building. That doesn't work. There's a kind of subtlety. But if it's a practical issue too. If you're ever working in another country, you are going to have to work with local architects and local people. So the important thing is that you gain their understanding and work closely with them. So in Beirut, Fadlala's and my name were jointly on the building.
Let's go back to symbolism.
Everything is symbolic. I mean, everything has a symbolic life as well as a practical life. It's a kind of medieval concept, actually, but it's true. I mean, you know, things mean things. We say simply, things have all kinds of ranges of meaning. I mean, in sort of elementary terms, if I turn up at a meeting wearing a tie, it means that it's not just that I'm putting a piece of decorative material around my neck. It actually means that I am presenting myself as someone who is smart. And we do this all the time. Everything we do is not just it's never solely practical. It's a whole range of meaning lying behind it. And buildings are the same. Of course, the key to the difficulty, important thing about the meaning of buildings, whereas I might wear a tie, I might not wear a tie, that's my choice, so I present myself. But a building in a place in which people occupy and with which they identify, it's part of their identity. Where you know, if you are a citizen of Rome or Florence or London or Winchester, where we are now, there's something about that place which is part of my identity. So if I start to remove that identity, I'm actually affecting the identity of the people that live there, and this is really important. And this is why there is so much objection to new buildings, because people assume that they're having their identity stripped away from them in some way. And this is important. I mean, our identity is who we are. There isn't anything else. And that applies to buildings as well. So if you at least try and understand and work with the way that people identify the buildings in their place, you will add to their identity. That's a contrary to take it away.
What would you suggest to a young architect that would like to design traditionally in a country that has no large traditional references?
There's a very interesting problem dealing with places that don't have a tradition of large buildings. I've often contemplated this one. I mean, what they've done in Doha is they have gone, or Qatar, they've gone to places where there is a cultural relationship. And that's not unreasonable. I mean, they've either gone to a place with a cultural relationship or with no cultural relationship at all. So I'm afraid that architects from America and Europe really don't have any cultural relationship. And that's very destructive. We could say it's constructive, we construct something new, but actually it has a serious effect on the identity of the place. The other one, and I think this also applies, it doesn't apply quite so much in what we loosely call the Middle East, which is one of this, because it's only the Middle East if you live in Europe, but we call it that, and it's only the East if you're not in China, in which case it's West. So anyway, it's different there because there are actually established traditions. Although even those, we know historically that a lot of Muslim traditions came from their interface with Byzantine architecture and developed it in its own particular way. But take a place like some parts of Africa where there really is no tradition. I think this is very interesting. If you look, for example, at the history of most of the great classical architects, and this would apply to Hindu architecture, it applies to Chinese architecture, it applies to classical architecture, very often it is a composite of smaller pieces. The real classic is the Hindu temple. The Hindu temple is like a lot of little temples put one on top of the other. And but that's a very particular type. But the two things happen. One is gigantism. In other words, you take something and you just make it bigger. The other, I would call it, is edicular, which is a sort of Latin, an edicule. You actually take a little piece and you assemble little pieces. Most traditional architecture consists of those two, a combination of those two things. I've never had a chance to do it, but this is a theoretical point of view which I've held for some time. So I've never actually had to work in somewhere whenever this is the case. But if you actually look at how traditional architects evolve, because they always began with something small. And we might have to go back 4,000 years or 2,000 years, but they always began with something small. The Greek temple was originally the form of a house. It was the house of the god. And then, of course, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it became gigantized, if you like. At the same time, as a part of that, there could be little temples inside the big temple, or alternatively, you could actually, as Hindu architecture, you could assemble lots of little buildings and make them into a big building. It's a very interesting idea, in my opinion, but possibly it requires research, but maybe one day.
Why do you think every architect should study classical architecture?
I think every architect should study it because it's important. I'll give you an example. I was asked by Theo Crosby, who's a famous architect, now died unfortunately, probably 20, 25 years ago, to teach classical architecture, a special course at the Royal College of Art. And I came, and the students sat there, like this. I said, we don't need to know this. I said, I'm sorry, but you're visually educated people. Why would you not want to know something about the built environment? What possible reason could there be for not knowing something that is all around you? You don't have to do it, but you have to understand it. So do you really not want to know what all the architects of the past are trying to tell you now? What possible reason could there be for that? Now, because it is very much a part of, well, I mean, if I'm dealing with North Atlantic countries, very much a part of your tradition and is very much there, even if you don't do it, you should at least know it. In as much as I know modernism, I mean, I don't practice modernist architecture. Some of my best friends are modernist architects. I don't have a problem with that. People are people, and they're not bad people. They just want to do different things. I understand that and know it. My copy of Version Architecture has fallen to pieces because I've referred to it so much. I probably know it off by heart more than most people because I have to refer to it in debate, because I have to know what I'm debating. So if you object to traditional architecture, you should understand it, and then you have a proper debate. Most people don't have even a proper debate about it. They caricature it, and of course what it does is it makes my argument with them terribly easy. So basically you should know. However, having said that, I started a summer school, which takes place once a year in Sweden for a month in classical architecture. We're oversubscribed. And all the people, some of the people aged 50 actually, and 60, but most of them are students. And what we've had to do at the beginning of every course is allow these students to talk to all the other people on the course about the fact that mere trying to do anything traditional at their college is a formula for failure. And they're so frustrated by this because they want to do it. This is quite extraordinary. So it's quite extraordinary. I mean, you should encourage people to do what they want. If it's not bad. You can't say it's evil to do it. You might think it's wrong. You might not like it. But you shouldn't stop. You shouldn't stop people doing this. So we feel very strongly we need to compensate for this extraordinary situation in education. When I tell people, ordinary people, not architects, that if you go to an architecture school, they will probably fail you if you try and do a classical building. They don't understand. They say, well, I don't understand. Why would that be the case? It's because architecture has become so doctrinaire and so tribal that actually you try and force people not to do things. Because why? Because you think it's betraying history? Well, I don't, that's a Marxist view. You actually believe that history is only going in one direction. I don't think it is. Or it's not for the future? Well, I don't know what the future is. If I knew what the future is, I'd be a very rich man. I'd make a lot of money on the stock market. So, no, I think knowledge is important, whatever kind of knowledge it is. And the idea that you ban knowledge or you actually don't let people do that is horrific. So we believe we should compensate that. We also believe in general terms, forget the type of education, that any architect or anyone in any profession, in fact, anyone artistic profession, who is convinced by what they should do, and comes across people who want to know it too, have a responsibility to do it. We have a responsibility to the future.